Good afternoon, and welcome to the Brain and Behavior Research Foundation's Meet the Scientist monthly webinar series. I'm Dr. Jeff Borenstein, BBRF's President and CEO. Today, Dr. Nathaniel Harnett will present PTSD, the brain basis of susceptibility. BBRF is the world's largest private funder of mental health research grants, supporting transformative discoveries in order to develop improved treatments, cures, and methods of prevention. The high quality of the research we fund is made possible by the BBRF Scientific Council. This group of 194 prominent mental health researchers reviews each grant application and selects the most promising ideas with the greatest potential to lead to breakthroughs. The Scientific Council guides the foundation to fund creative and impactful basic, translational, and clinical research relevant to the whole spectrum of mental health. One reason that research funded by BBRF has had such a great impact is because we don't limit ourselves to one illness or condition. Since 1987, the foundation has awarded over $450 million to fund more than 6,500 research grants around the world and across a broad spectrum of brain illnesses, including addiction, ADHD, anxiety, autism, bipolar disorder, borderline personality disorder, depression, eating disorders, OCD, post-traumatic stress, schizophrenia, as well as suicide prevention. Today, I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Nathaniel Harnett. Dr. Harnett is an assistant professor of psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. He was a BBRF 2021 Young Investigator. Our webinar will begin with his presentation, which will then be followed by Q&A. To submit your questions, please use the Questions tab on the control panel on your screen. Feel free to submit your questions at any time. Following the presentation, I'll ask as many questions that are possible in the time allotted. And now I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Harnett. Nate, the floor is yours.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jeff. I really appreciate the opportunity to present some of the stuff that we've been working on, and thank you again to everyone for joining us. So I'm going to talk quite a bit about what we've learned over the last 10 years and really especially the last 2 years in terms of what we think is happening in the brain that makes some individuals more likely to develop PTSD than others. This is going to be a little bit of a journey. We're going to start with some of the work that we began early on, really trying to get the foundational neural substrates of PTSD susceptibility. I'll talk a little bit about where we might have gone wrong and what things we might have missed. And I'll talk at the end a little bit about where we're going and how we're trying to improve our specificity so we can really develop actual neurobiological signatures of PTSD susceptibility. To make sure that we're all on the same page, I'm going to talk a little bit about trauma as a concept. I think most of us understand what trauma is, but I just want to make sure we're on the same page. So we often think about trauma in terms of individuals who served in the military or deployed overseas, but the reality is that there are many different types of things that can be traumatic in our daily lives. Things like serious accidents, fires or explosions, natural disasters like tornadoes, hurricanes, or floods, assaultive experiences that are sexual or non-sexual in nature, even things like car accidents or learning about the death of a family member or loved one can all be things that are considered traumatic. And within the DSM-5 definition of what a criterion A traumatic event is, this is something that involves actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence that either happened directly to you, you witnessed it happening to someone else, you learned of it happening to a family member or friend, or you're exposed to repeated extreme details of the event, such as in the case if you're a first responder. And when I talk about all the different types of traumatic events and all the different ways that someone can be exposed, it's probably not going to surprise you if I say that trauma is highly prevalent in the United States. It's actually a major public health concern. There are over 30 million individuals every year who experience a potential traumatic event, and our best epidemiological data suggests that at least 55%, but probably closer to 90% of individuals will experience at least one traumatic event within their lifetime. And as a result of this high prevalence, there's a lot of people that are potentially susceptible to these highly deleterious consequences of trauma. most notably post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD. I think a lot of us have heard about that. This is a disorder in which individuals can experience intrusive memories, so thoughts or feelings about the traumatic event that come into their head even when they don't want them to. They can develop these symptoms of avoidance. They avoid people or places or things that even remind them of the traumatic event. They can develop these negative thoughts and beliefs about themselves or the world, things like the world is an inherently dangerous place, or I deserve the things that happen to me. And they also develop these sort of prototypical symptoms of hyperarousal, so being jumpy or easily startled, such as if a car backfires or during fireworks. And because of the nature of PTSD, it's also highly costly, not just to the individual in terms of their emotional function, but to society at large. This is data from several years ago, but really the excess costs of treating PTSD exceed billions of dollars every single year because of the direct healthcare costs, the loss of employment, productivity loss, and all these other things. So we really want to understand what is it that drives individuals to be susceptible to PTSD, and how do we start to relegate resources to those most in need so we can mitigate not just the financial and social burdens of the disorder, but the emotional burdens as well. And so as neuroscientists, we're really focused on thinking about the brain as the end-all and be-all of behavior and mental health. And so we really try to focus on how do we start to study the brain, how do we start to look at what neural substrates are really going to tell us who's likely to go on to develop PTSD. The primary way that we've tried to do this is by looking primarily at the neural circuitry that underlies threat learning. I think people have heard of classical or Pavlovian conditioning, but just as a primer, during Pavlovian conditioning, when we learn that a stimulus is associated with a potential threat, we present individuals with an innocuous cue called a conditioned stimulus or CS, and we pair it with an innately aversive unconditioned stimulus or UCS that elicits a defensive response in an individual called the unconditional response or UCR. And through repeated pairing of the CS and UCS, people learn, hey, if I get the CS, I'm going to get the UCS, and they develop this learned anticipatory response called the conditional response in anticipation that the UCS is going to occur. And through many, many years of both basic research and translational research, we have a really good idea of what the fundamental circuit is that controls this threat learning. We really think it's focused on the amygdala, shown down here in blue, the hippocampus, shown here in red, and different components of the prefrontal cortex, shown here in green, purple, and yellow. And just as a basic primer, the way that we think this circuit works is that information about the cue and the threat are passed the amygdala, there's associative LTP, there's memory formation that happens within these neural circuits, and it's projected to downstream affector brain regions that help to elicit the fear response or expression of the peripheral emotional response. You can imagine if you're giving a talk to a major foundation, you might be nervous, your hands might start to sweat, you might be grateful that you're doing this over a webinar so people can't see that. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about the fear response, a sort of physiological response to stress. The hippocampus is really important for modulation of these threat or fear memories by context. And so, for example, if I'm out in the woods and I hear the hiss of a snake, that's a potentially dangerous situation that I need to be ready for. But if I'm sitting on the couch watching Animal Planet, my hippocampus can tell me I don't really need to be in fear mode right now. And then different components of the prefrontal cortex are really important for cognitive and affective processes that also help to regulate the emotional response to threat. And all of these regions working in concert is really important for our emotional health. And we think that the disconnectivity and the disactivity within them are what help to bring about PTSD symptoms in individuals who have experienced trauma. We really like studying this circuit from a translational perspective because it is highly translatable. Smarter people than me can look in animal models and look at specific cellular and molecular targets that help to control the expression or inhibition of that fear response. We can take a look at the circuit using human neuroscience approaches and look at what's really happening in different larger brain regions when people are presented with cues that predict whether or not they're going to experience a threat or not. And then we can take all of that information and look at it in individuals who actually have these different psychiatric conditions, who have PTSD. And we can look and see, do the sort of brain processes that we think are disrupted, or do they actually map onto the symptoms that people are telling us about, the sort of burdens that they're facing? And anything that we don't find or that doesn't work when looking from the animal models to the psychiatric patients, we can actually go back to the animal models and change everything. So we have this really nice bench to bedside to back again model for understanding PTSD and PTSD susceptibility. One of the major issues we've had for a long time, however, is that a lot of what we've done in terms of studying PTSD has been done in individuals who've had PTSD for months or even years or decades. And it's not been clear to us for a long time if the brain processes we see that are disrupted, if they're really a result of susceptibility to PTSD or might reflect sort of secondary stressors or traumas that individuals might face as a result of having PTSD. And so a lot of the work that we've done over the last 10 years, especially over the last 3, has been trying to look at neuroimaging and the early aftermath of trauma, looking at individuals who have recently survived the traumatic event to understand what are the specific neural processes that actually make them susceptible. And so how this typically works in the studies that we do is we take individuals who've recently experienced a traumatic event. This is often something like a car accident, high fall, exposure to fire, and we just ask them, hey, can we take a bunch of different pictures of your brain and look and see, as you're doing these different tasks for us, what it actually looks like. And so we try to recruit them for these MRI studies shortly after the traumatic event, within about a month. And then we'll follow these individuals for a period of time, whether that be 3, 6, 12 months, it depends a little bit on the study. And we ask them and we assess, how are their PTSD symptoms? Do they have other comorbid symptoms like depression or anxiety? And so that we have these really nice prognostic neuroimaging biomarkers potentially of future PTSD susceptibility. And so for the first part of this talk, I'm going to be talking a little bit about, or quite a bit about actually, some of the data that we've been able to get by taking this sort of approach. One of the first things that we sought to look at is just to ask the question of, we know that threat learning is important for emotional health. We know it's involved in PTSD. Do we see these acute effects of trauma exposure? Does traumatic stress disrupt basic threat learning processes? And so to do this, we recruited a number of individuals who had recently experienced a traumatic event and some individuals who hadn't experienced a traumatic event. And we had them complete, again, that same basic Pavlovian conditioning task that I talked about before. And so what we do during this task is we present, or we play for them a pure tone that always co-terminates with our unconditioned stimulus, in this case, a loud white noise. In a different trial type, we play a different sounding tone that serves as a safety cue that's never paired with that unconditioned stimulus. In a third trial type that I'm not really going to talk about, we just present the unconditioned stimulus by itself. And while participants are in the scanner doing this task, we give them a little rating bar and we ask them to rate on a moment-by-moment basis how certain they are that that loud white noise is going to occur, where 0 is they're certain it's not about to occur, 50 is they're not really sure one way or the other, and 100 is they're certain that loud white noise is about to occur in the next moment. And when we look at individuals who haven't recently experienced a traumatic event, we see the type of pattern of results that we might expect, where the expectancy that that loud white noise is going to occur is greater when the cue that is paired with it is played versus when we pair that CS minus or safety cue. But when we look at recent trauma survivors, we actually don't see any difference in expectancy. They're showing high expectancy for that loud white noise during both the CS plus and the CS minus. And what's really different between these trauma exposed and recent trauma survivors and non-trauma exposed individuals really is this expectancy during the safety trials. And when we look at the neuroimaging data, we really see that part of what's happening is that individuals who are able to keep their expectancy of the loud white noise low during these safety trials really need this sort of greater engagement of the medial prefrontal cortex, which really involved in sort of top-down regulation of the amygdala-mediated emotional response. And so I think one of the first things that we really figured out from the work was that trauma really does seem to be having this effect on, at least acutely after the traumatic event, this understanding of safety, and that might be driven by this sort of dysfunction of top-down emotional control regions. And so really we're saying that traumatic stress does seem to have an impact, particularly on learning of safety. One of the other things we're really interested in trying to figure out, though, is not just, is it that traumatic stress disrupts threat, but does that contribute to downstream issues in terms of the development of PTSD? And we're not the first people to ask these questions. Katie McLaughlin had done a study looking at young adults who were doing in fear tasks where they were looking at either negative or neutral images, and she was measuring how much amygdala activity there was. In the middle of data collection, the Boston Marathon bombing happened. And so she brought these individuals back in and had this brain imaging data from right before they were exposed to trauma and then their PTSD symptoms after. And what she was able to see was that greater amygdala activity was associated with greater PTSD symptoms after the traumatic event. Jenny Stevens, who's at Emory University, did something very similar, looking at individuals who were in emergency departments recruited shortly after their traumatic event, and was able to show that both amygdala activity and BMPFC activity was associated with both 1 month and 12-month PTSD symptoms. So across multiple studies, we're seeing that activation of this different threat neurocircuitry is associated with future PTSD symptoms. But beyond just looking at how brain regions activate and how that's associated with PTSD symptoms, we can also look at the connectivity between them. So we can start to understand at both a functional level and structural level how these brain regions interact with one another and if that's associated with PTSD symptoms in the future. So one thing that we've looked at is something called functional connectivity. And this is really just if you take different brain regions and you look at how they're activating over time, are they correlated with one another? Is that sort of time series of activity very similar between them? If they are, we can say that they're functionally connected. And when we look at that in some of our data, what we tend to see is that sort of greater connectivity between the prefrontal cortex and this what we call arousal network, which encompasses both the amygdala and hippocampus, is negatively associated with future PTSD symptoms. And so perhaps reflecting greater ability of the prefrontal cortex to modulate amygdala hippocampal activity is actually associated with improved outcomes 3 months after the traumatic event. In addition to functional connectivity, we can also look at things like structural connectivity. In this case, we're looking at the strength of white matter connections, or what we might call integrity of these different white matter connections. I like to think of it much more as like the pavement on a highway, in that if you have a recently paved highway, traffic usually flows a lot better. If there's a lot of potholes, it's a lot more difficult. You have a potential restriction of information flow between these regions. And so when we look at structural connectivity, and in several studies that we found, we've really seen that decrements in structural connectivity, decrements in structural integrity are associated with actually greater PTSD symptoms. And so this track here is the onset fasciculus. We think it connects the prefrontal cortex to regions like the amygdala. And in individuals that show lesser integrity of this track, they actually show greater PTSD symptoms overall. So across a few different data sets and across a few different modalities, we've been able to show that a sort of dysregulation of both the functional and structural connectivity of this underlying threat neurocircuitry is really important for understanding PTSD. And so together we really have, I think, a nice story of like, first of all, we can show that traumatic stress is having a sort of observable impact on threat learning and threat neurobiology. If we really look, we can see that traumatic stress is affecting both the structure and the functional connectivity of these brain regions. For us, this is really important because it's something that is replicable, it's reliable, and really suggests that we might have an ideal target for thinking about how we translate our understanding of threat neurocircuitry to both prediction and prevention of future symptoms of PTSD. And I would love to end the talk there, but it's only been 20 minutes. And so you can imagine that there's quite a bit more to talk about. And if you really think about it, things can't just end with the brain. Well, they can, but there's a lot of stuff that happens before we get to the traumatic event that might be really important to think about, things like the rest of life itself. And so we've been trying to think about what aspects of pre-traumatic exposures might modulate neural circuitry that is then related to future PTSD symptoms or affect PTSD susceptibility. One of the places that we started was really thinking about the formative years of development, thinking about early life traumatic events that might shape individuals' futures. We've known for a long time that early life trauma, or things like adverse childhood experiences, are really important to development. We know that ACEs can impact things like physical, mental, or emotional health, and we know that they're highly prevalent. At least 60% of individuals in the United States experience at least one adverse childhood experience, and many people experience 2, 3, 4, or more of these different things. And ACEs really run the gambit. They can be things like abuse and neglect, witnessing violence in the community, growing up around a lack of resources, or even growing up around substance abuse. And so we've been really wondering, how does the exposure to these many different types of ACEs impact the neural circuitry that we're seeing underlies PTSD susceptibility. A student in my lab, Sammy Wong, who's now at NYU, was really interested in trying to ask that question, particularly when it comes to underlying structural connectivity of the brain. And so what Sammy did was look at childhood maltreatment load. This is really just how many different types of adverse childhood experiences these individuals had prior to the traumatic event that brought them into our study. And she looked at structural connectivity across the whole brain, really focusing on something called the internal capsule. And this is a white matter tract that carries a lot of different sensory fibers from different modalities, whether that be hearing or vision or touch. And what she saw was that individuals who had greater childhood maltreatment load actually showed lower integrity of this internal capsule tract. What was really interesting is that if we look at how people were doing later on after the traumatic event, 6 months following the traumatic event itself, and we're looking at their PTSD symptoms, we really see that the history of their childhood maltreatment does impact their PTSD symptoms later on, but it's really mediated by its impact on this underlying white matter microstructure. And so what's really important, I think, from this data is that, yes, we're seeing that childhood trauma really does seem to modify these neural circuits that carry important sensory information, potentially to different threat neural circuits that ultimately contribute to future PTSD susceptibility. There are other different types of pre-traumatic events or pre-traumatic experiences we might think about in terms of being important for understanding future PTSD susceptibility. Grace Rowland, who's currently in my lab, was really interested in trying to understand not just sexual trauma in and of itself, but really at the level of childhood sexual abuse and adult sexual violence, and looking at individuals who had experienced these different things and then gone on to experience another trauma like a car accident. And what Grace saw as part of this work was that, as you might expect, individuals who had a prior history of trauma exposure showed greater symptoms across sort of a transdiagnostic list or array of different symptoms, whether that be depression symptoms, anxiety symptoms, or PTSD. But really, individuals who are experiencing prior sexual trauma were at the greatest risk of having high depression, anxiety, or PTSD symptoms compared to people who hadn't experienced a prior sexual trauma. And what she was able to show was that this sort of prior exposure to sexual trauma was modulating connectivity from the amygdala to the sensory cortex. So again, brain region really involved in threat and expression, emotional response, brain region really important for visual processing, which we think is related to some of the findings that Sammy had, showing that these sort of aspects of childhood maltreatment are affecting neural circuitry that helps to carry sensory information between these different regions. And so, similar to what Sammy found, our real takeaway from Grace is that these sort of highly adverse pre-traumatic events really can seem to heighten later symptoms, and they also modify the same functional and structural connectivity of both threat and sensory circuitry that we thought was really important for understanding PTSD susceptibility. We've also started thinking not just about singular events like exposure of childhood maltreatment or prior sexual trauma, but really thinking at the context in which kids and individuals are growing up in, developing in, and living in, and trying to think about at a geographic level what might be happening that shapes the experiences that they have. And so we've been looking at large-scale metrics that help to contextualize different neighborhoods people grow up in. We've been looking at neighborhood disadvantage as indexed by the area deprivation index. What you can see on this map is Maryland in the United States. And what we have is different counties in the state that have different levels of what we call the area deprivation index. Regions that are more red have higher deprivation. Regions that are more blue have lower deprivation or are more advantaged. We can also look at other factors like residential green space, which might reflect access to parks or other structures like that, as indexed through the National Vegetation Index. Most of this work is done by a postdoc in my lab named Kate Webb. And what Kate's really been able to show is that the sort of, when you're looking at aspects of neighborhood disadvantage, when you're looking at the area deprivation index, that this context, this access to resources really is driving differences, not just in function, but also in white matter and gray matter structure in recent trauma survivors. And it's within these same regions that we've really been thinking about for a long time in terms of the threat neurocircuitry. So what Kate shows is that when we look at reactivity to threatening faces, in this case, fearful faces or neutral faces, that levels of deprivation, that aspects of disadvantage are really associated with greater reactivity within the same brain region that we thought was mediating this sort of overgeneralization of threat to safety cues in our earlier research. What she also shows is that the underlying white matter of the dorsal medial prefrontal cortex and the underlying gray matter of the dorsal medial prefrontal cortex are also associated with area deprivation. So the context that individuals are developing are having this real multimodal effect on the regions that underlie some of the behavioral effects that we see of traumatic stress. She's also looked at how green space shapes these different responses across a number of different regions like the ventral medial prefrontal cortex and nucleus accumbens, but really sees that these effects are specific to the amygdala, and they're really specific to what we call reward reactivity. And so during this task, individuals are being asked to guess the value of a card game, and if they get it right, they win some money. So it's sort of a positive reward that they can get, and if they get it wrong, they lose some money. And so really, I think the important thing about the green space data is that what we're seeing is that individuals who grow up in areas with more green space are showing this greater reward reactivity. They're having more amygdala responses to positive salient events within their environment. And so when we take that in with what we've been seeing from the work that Sammy did, from the work that Grace did, from the work that we've done, what we're really trying to say here is that the wider context of development that people are in really is having these observable impacts on how the brain responds to stress. So at this point, we've talked quite a bit about why we think threat neurocircuitry is incredibly important for PTSD susceptibility. We've talked a little bit about why we think pre-traumatic responses are really important and why the developmental context is really important. And so I want to take about 10 minutes to shift, however, and talk about one aspect of the pre-traumatic environment that I think is really important to think about and contextualize in the United States, and that's the fact that a lot of the exposures that we're talking about here are very highly racialized, and that there's a disproportionate exposure of both adverse childhood experiences and the environments that people are growing up in, depending on ethno-racial group that people tend to be assigned to. And so this is data from childtrends.org, and it's looking at the percentage of children with one ACE or two or more ACEs. And really, regardless of where you're looking within the United States, whether that be the New England area, the Pacific, the East South Central, individuals who come from racially or ethnically marginalized backgrounds tend to experience more adverse childhood experiences than individuals who grow up white, non-Hispanic. That's not to say that individuals who are white, non-Hispanic don't experience these things, just the data bears out that there's a disproportionate exposure depending on the group that you're assigned to. And we've seen, even in our own data, that access to things like neighbor disadvantage or green space is also very much tied to the ethno-racial group that people tend to be a part of. So not only do these sort of individual events that are pre-traumatic differ by group, but the wider context that people grow up in are also different by group in ways that might have an impact on the sort of neural circuitry that underlies, or that we think underlies, PTSD susceptibility. We can get really granular with this too. This is a great example, I think, of the myriad of ways that disparities can influence aspects of health and well-being. This is a study done several years ago now by looking at premature death rates by where people get off in the T. You don't know what the T is, it's Boston's attempt at doing a train system or subway. But what you can see is that there are areas like Maverick or Dudley Square or Mattapan that have the highest rates of premature death. And if you overlay that with the racial and ethnic demographics of Boston itself, you see that there's a very clear pattern to that, where Maverick and East Boston is highly Hispanic, Mattapan and Dudley Square largely Black. And so we really want to think about, if our goal as neuroscientists is to develop generalizable and actionable neural targets of PTSD susceptibility, it's really important for us to make sure we're thinking about, do the signatures that we've looked at, are they potentially influenced by these different racial inequities that might make it so that anything we find doesn't work for all individuals. And so I'm going to take about 10 minutes to talk about some of the work that we've done in this area and thinking about how we start to approach the concept of generalizable neural signatures for PTSD susceptibility. one of the first places that we started was thinking about how might these structural inequities actually impact the brain at the level of the child. So this was work that was led by Natalie DeMornay, who's in my lab, who's now at the University of Minnesota. She was looking at data from the Adolescent Brain and Cognitive Development Study. This is a multi-site longitudinal study of development that started when individuals were about 9 to 10 years old. I think they're about 14 to 15 now, that collects a huge array of data related to brain and physiology and parent environment and environment itself and demographics. Natalie was really interested in understanding sort of how do racial disparities and things like family conflict or hardship, trauma load, education, or neighborhood disadvantage impact underlying brain structure by looking at brain minor volume? And is this different between Black and white individuals at this age group? So this is a sample of, I think, about 9,000 individuals once we exclude individuals. And I want to say right off the bat, when we're talking about race-related differences in brain biology, what we're really talking about, and I think what the data will bear out when I show it, is we're really talking about differences in experiences that these kids have had. So even within the ABCD data set, compared to white children, Black children within the data set had caregivers with less education, caregivers that were more often unemployed or had lower family income, and they were coming from areas that were much more disadvantaged. They were also experiencing more conflict and hardship in the home, and even at 9 and 10 years old, were endorsing a greater number of traumatic events, and for those that did, a higher severity of PTSD symptoms. And so right off the bat, the environment that these kids are growing up in is not equal at all. And so when Natalie looked at the actual brain imaging data, we saw these fairly small but significant differences across many of the brain regions that we've been talking about before. Many of these are different subcomponents of the prefrontal cortex, the hippocampus, and the amygdala. I do want to show these graphs in particular, though, because while a lot of these differences are significant, they're still very small, and that's to be expected when kids are about 9 to 10 years old and we're looking at a large array of individuals. We're not expecting to see completely different brains based off of race, but we would expect at 9 and 10 to see some small effects that we worry might balloon as these individuals get older and as they start to be continuously exposed to the adverse environments that we're talking about here. One of the things that Natalie did, though, was she looked to ask the question, well, what would happen if we actually took away these disparities? Would this normalize the sort of differences in brain biology that we see? I think this slide is very busy, so I'm going to condense it down to what we're talking about. What Natalie essentially did was a series of mediation analyses to ask the question, once we account for the differences in income, once we account for the differences in neighborhood disadvantage, in trauma, and hardship, do we actually see normalization of these race-related differences? And the truth is, the answer is kind of yeah, we do. And across many of the regions that you can see in yellow, largely the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, again, same region that was really important for effects of traumatic stress, same region that Kate saw effects in terms of impacts of neighborhood disadvantage. We account for up to 60% of the variance of race-related differences by accounting for these sort of 9 very coarse level understanding of socioeconomic inequity. And so the major point to take away from this is that even in kids as 9 and 10 years old, we're really seeing that these disparities in developmental context and exposure are driving the appearance of differences in brain structure within regions that we think are important for understanding PTSD susceptibility, raising the potential that we might be reflecting some bias in the way that we've been approaching this question in terms of whether or not these effects that we've seen are really going to be generalizable across all individuals. And this dovetails nicely with some work that we had done a little bit prior, focusing on adults or young adults about 18 to 23 years old from Birmingham, Alabama. These individuals, we had data going back from when they were about 8th grade related to their levels of violence exposure, their family income levels, and neighborhood disadvantage. I don't know what people know about Birmingham, Alabama, but it's a region with a very storied civil rights history that's really shaped the demographics of the city today. If you look at the north side of Birmingham, it's still very highly disadvantaged, whereas the south side is highly advantaged, and that relates very well with the racial makeup or majority racial makeup of the different boroughs within Birmingham, where the north is largely Black, The South is largely white. And as you might expect from this data, our participants have very different experiences in terms of levels of violence exposure, income, and neighborhood disadvantage, where Black individuals are exposed to much more violence, have much lower family income, and live in areas that are much more highly disadvantaged. And when we look at the neuroimaging data from these individuals, we're looking again at how they're responding to that threatening sound. We're looking at the response to that UCS, that loud white noise. And we really see these strong differences across mostly the entire brain in reactivity to threat between Black and white individuals. And when we burrow down into thinking about that main neural circuit that we've been talking about, the prefrontal cortex, hippocampus, and amygdala, what we really see are these sort of blunted reactivity to threat within Black American individuals compared to white American individuals. And we really think that's probably driven by the differences in exposures that they've had. And so just like Natalie, once we account for the differences in income, once we account for the differences in the types of neighborhoods that they're growing up in, we really see the same thing that she did, where we really completely eliminate these sort of race-related differences, excuse me, and how individuals are reacting to the threat. And so what that says to us is that these socioeconomic inequities that we've been talking about really are driving race-related differences and neurophysiological responses to threat in regions that we really think underlie PTSD susceptibility, even as they start to get older. I want to take one quick second to talk not just about the effect of inequity, but the effect of interpersonal discrimination. This is work really driven by collaborations with colleagues Nagar Fani at Emory University and Sierra Carter at Georgia State University, where they're looking at, I guess we were looking at, individuals who are coming from a highly disadvantaged area in the Atlanta, Georgia area, and they were completing a task that involves cognitive distraction. So they do something called the Stroop task, where you have to say the number of items on the screen and not read. So if there's 3 threes, the answer here is 3. Here there's 4 threes, the answer here is 4. I hope I got that right. I usually get it wrong. They also present distracting images that are either trauma relevant for these individuals or they're neutral images. And the idea is that individuals have to ignore distracting information to do well in the task. And even though these individuals are from regions where there's a lot of structural inequity, there's a lot of socioeconomic inequity, they're also experiencing high levels of racial discrimination. And so when Nagar and Sierra actually look at the data, one of the surprising things they saw was that individuals who have greater exposure to racial discrimination are actually making fewer errors on this task. They're actually doing much better. And the region that pops out as really important for this impact that we're seeing really is the sort of ventral prefrontal cortex as a region that is important for regulating the amygdala-mediated emotional response. And so one interpretation that you can have from this is that, if you are someone who's had to deal with a lot of racial discrimination, you've had to deal with a lot of interpersonal chaos, you still have to go to work, you still have to put food on the table, you get really good at regulating yourself to distracting information so that you can do the things that you need to do. The issue is that this probably comes at some sort of cost. And in fact, when Nagar and Sierra actually look at other imaging data, when they look at the underlying white matter structure of the data, they actually see that racial discrimination is associated with decrements in major association tracts, including the corpus callosum, the cingulum, and the longitudinal fasciculus. And when they take that a step further, what they're able to show is that racial discrimination is having impact on white matter microstructure, or the sort of structural connectivity that we talked about before, and that's contributing to downstream health problems like risk for cardiovascular disease or diabetes or stroke. And so even though individuals performed better at this task, this sort of exposure to racial discrimination was associated with worsened brain structure and more health problems. And the important thing there for us is that, it's not that exposure to different types of stressors leads to an immediate health deficit, and that these individuals are developing these sort of adaptive coping mechanisms to deal with the stress of discrimination in the context of the stresses they have in their larger environment, but it's coming at this major cost and contributing to alterations both in terms of function and structure of these major regions that, again, we really think are important for understanding PTSD susceptibility. And so the underlying question that I think we've been circling with in the last few minutes is, okay, if we really think that structural inequity and racial discrimination are important, is it, and we know it's impacting now these different threat neurocircuits that we care about, is it having an impact on our ability to predict who's going to develop PTSD? And again, there's about 10 minutes, and the answer really is yes. So in work that we've been doing, we've been looking again at individuals who've recently experienced a traumatic event, and we've been looking at functional connectivity between the amygdala and these other threat-related regions like the dorsal medial prefrontal cortex and dorsal lateral prefrontal cortex. And when we break this down by racial and ethnic group, whether that individuals are Hispanic or Black or white, we really see differences in the strength of connectivity between these different regions, depending on what ethno-racial group people are part of. But if we look at how these patterns of connectivity are associated with PTSD symptoms, we see these differential associations with 3-month PTSD symptoms from the data that was collected 2 weeks after the traumatic event. So, and what we see is that Hispanic individuals show this negative relationship, white individuals show an orthogonal or no relationship, and Black individuals show a positive relationship. And so really what we're seeing is that the sort of differences and experiences that people are having that's tied to ethno-racial group really are impacting the underlying neural circuitry of threat acutely after the traumatic event, and that is associated with differential predictive ability of 3-month PTSD symptoms. And so we really have this sort of issue where the racial inequity that we've kind of been ignoring for a while is undermining our ability to find sort of generalizable and actual neural signatures of PTSD. So what we've been trying to do over the last several years in finding these data is thinking about how we come up with really generalizable, really actual signatures for PTSD that aren't going to have this issue with racial inequity. And part of where we've been moving based on the work that I showed earlier is really thinking about how sensorial circuitry, particularly visual circuitry, interfaces with this basic threat neurocircuitry that we've been talking about, and if that sort of interaction might be really important to think about. So we know that these sort of aspects of sensory motor development, particularly visual development, really follows a different time scale than the development of different association cortices, like the, in particular the prefrontal cortex. But we also know that this aspect of the ventral visual stream, this sort of track that's really important for recognizing different objects in the environment, actually really has dense interconnections with the same threat neurocircuitry that we've been talking about this entire time. They form a very integral and important neural network that helps us to understand threatening stimuli within our environment. We're not the first person to think about this. Maya Rosen and Katie McLaughlin have thought, and from a developmental perspective, how interactions between the ventral visual stream and the prefrontal cortex are related to things or mediate aspects of socioeconomic status and executive function. And we're starting to think now, how do we take a look at these data or at these neural connections and relate them to PTSD susceptibility? So not getting too far into the analytic weeds, we've been able to look at the sort of underlying structure of this same track in individuals who have recently experienced a traumatic event, and been able to show that the structure of the ventral visual stream really is associated with PTSD symptoms both 2 weeks and 6 months after the traumatic event in several different studies. And so we're really thinking that the sort of analog of the ventral visual stream might be this sort of reliable signature of PTSD that we can use in place of just focusing on underlying threat neurocircuitry. We think it's important both functionally as well, because we see that the actual strength of the sort of structure of the ventral visual stream is tied to other aspects of visual disturbances that people have acutely after the traumatic event, most notably nightmare symptoms that individuals might have as a result of experiencing the trauma. And we also see that that same aspect of ventral visual stream modulates connectivity between threat regions that we know are important, like the amygdala and hippocampus. So we really think that PTSD susceptibility, beyond just thinking about threat neurocircuitry, really needs to start taking into account both sensory circuitry and threat neurocircuitry to derive these sort of robust generalizable targets. The research that I'll end on that's ongoing is really trying to focus on understanding at a basic level what might be happening in the circuitry. So we've sort of moved a little bit away from focusing on affect and really just said, if we try to stimulate this region in a very basic way, like if we just flash a checkerboard for individuals, does that impact underlying neural circuitry? Is that impacted by trauma exposure? And so in the preliminary data that we have, we've been able to do this task and we see exactly what we expect, which is this robust activation of the primary visual cortex. But if we look at individuals who have been recently exposed to trauma versus people who haven't recently been exposed to trauma, we see these very large differences in primary visual cortex activation, or deactivation rather, once the flashing checkerboard is taken off. And what's really interesting is that we actually see this interaction effect within the dorsal prefrontal cortex, where individuals who have not recently experienced a traumatic event don't really show any difference between whether or not we're presenting that checkerboard or not. Well, once individuals have been trauma exposed, they actually show this greater activation in DMPFC once that flashing checkerboard is taken off. I think what's really interesting is that if you plot this in a slightly different way, it looks very similar to what we saw in terms of the top-down dysregulation contributing to altered safety learning in recent trauma survivors tied to threat learning. And so at this point, we're taking apart, or trying to take apart what might be happening in terms of interactions between visual cortex and ventral visual stream, as well as dorsal prefrontal cortex, this threat neurocircuitry that might be tied to or better predict the development of PTSD in recent trauma survivors that gets past all of the inequity and bias that we might have had in some of these data. So we've gone through a lot of data in a relatively short amount of time. So just to summarize the major points that we've talked about, the first thing that I've tried to convince you of is that we know quite a bit about PTSD susceptibility by focusing on the underlying neural circuits that help to process threatening information, really focused on the amygdala, hippocampus, and prefrontal cortex. We have some compelling data, I think, that really suggests that by understanding how these different regions talk to one another and how they're structured together, we really can identify, at least for some individuals, whether or not they're likely to go on to develop PTSD. The caveat that we have with some of that data is that because of ongoing inequity within the United States and because of how we structure our scientific studies, there's quite a bit of bias that seeps into the neural models that we might have a PTSD susceptibility. And so it's unclear the extent to which some of our models, particularly the ones that are based off threat neurocircuitry, are really going to work for all individuals. And so we're trying to broaden these models a bit by thinking about other neural circuits beyond basic threat neurocircuitry to integrate sensorial circuitry to overcome potential racial bias and lead to really generalizable actual neural targets of PTSD susceptibility. But I think what our data really means for the field of trying to understand MRI markers of PTSD is that this neuroimaging that we do in the early aftermath of trauma really is probably going to provide us really important information about the neurobiology of post-traumatic dysfunction and how that develops. But we really need to start thinking beyond, just taking MRI markers and correlating those with PTSD and thinking about the sort of pre-traumatic influences that people have. What's happening early on in development? What kind of contextual factors might modify neural responses in a way that's actually adaptive or might mask some of the effects that we're trying to look for, and especially thinking in terms of how racial inequity might be driving some of these differences that we see. We also think that beyond just thinking about core threat neurocircuitry, really trying to integrate data from other distributed neural circuits. For us, we really think this is going to be sensorial or visual circuits in particular, might really help us understand the maintenance and progression of PTSD symptoms from that acute phase after the recent traumatic event, these sort of more long-term or potentially into the development of a chronic form of PTSD. And so as we move forward, we're really going to be thinking about how do we start to integrate all these different neural models across all these different modalities to really come up with these sort of generalizable markers of the pathophysiology of PTSD. So with that, I am going to end there. I just want to acknowledge all the people in my lab and our collaborators and everyone else who's done so much work on this. And of course, thank you to all our funders, including the Brain Behavior Research Foundation, and happy to take any questions.
Nate, thank you so much. You packed a lot of information in a short time, and really were able to bring together some of the very basic neurobiology aspects with broader issues of people's experiences and how they interplay. So thank you for a great presentation. I have a question about, are there anything that people can do now if let's say a child has experienced a traumatic event or many traumatic events, or is living under circumstances that have a negative effect on them because of racial inequity. What can parents, teachers, mental health professionals, what can they do to help somebody who's experienced those kind of things, and to help decrease the risk of post-traumatic stress down the road?
I think that's a fabulous question. I think that, we're thinking in many different ways about what can do. And I think at the most immediate level, just recognition of the potential for these things to impact the child and trying to get resources directed to them, whether that be from a mental health professional, whether that be from a school counselor, whether that be having parents connect deeper with their kids about the emotions that they're experiencing, particularly at a time in their lives where they're really trying to figure out, who they are and why they feel this way and all these other sort of introspective aspects. I think that's important. I also, do feel it's probably important to say a little bit about, the sort of structural issues that we have that contribute to that, right? And that thinking about how do we start to, or, advocating for more sort of systemic change in terms of how we deal with issues within the legal system, how we direct resources at state and local government levels towards different programs designed to alleviate burden, whether that be through, similar Medicaid or welfare programs, and thinking about how we actually direct those resources. And so I think that at the individual level, in terms of, my child or someone I know is being exposed to these things, trying to figure out how to get them, basically to a mental health provider, someone who can, more appropriately administer that, I think is probably the first and most important thing. And then thinking about, how we change these at the systemic level is another important aspect.
I think both aspects are important. What you do in the here and now for a particular child growing up, and what could be done in the broader picture that could hopefully have a very positive impact over the long term for society and obviously individuals as well.
Yeah.
Have you been able to look at some of the neurobiology for PTSD and how that relates to some of the comorbid diagnoses that often occur in people who have PTSD?
Yeah, that's a great question. So a lot of times what we will do is, as we saw in sort of Grace's work, we collect data that's related to depression or anxiety or dissociation in addition to PTSD. And so we will look at how predictive the neural models we have are, not just for PTSD, but also for depression and anxiety. And I would say that, because I've set myself up to give that answer, the evidence is sort of mixed. For the work that we've done looking at functional or structural connectivity, we often see that, yes, it's related to PTSD, as I discussed, but can also occasionally be related to depression or anxiety, especially in the early aftermath, where many of these things are very comorbid. We often see sort of a general post-traumatic reaction factor, if you will, that's associated with these aspects of threat neurobiology reactivity. I think what's interesting, and I think why we sort of moved a little bit more to focusing on sensory and threat circuitry integration, is that when we look at the data for the ventral visual stream, if we compare the results with from predicting PTSD to predicting depression or anxiety, it is very specific to PTSD. And so we're thinking that, at least in the way that we've approached this, that the approach for focusing on sensory and threat integration might be a little bit more specific to aspects of PTSD compared to depression or anxiety.
Okay, good, thank you. And with all the looking at the circuitry, where do you see the role of TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation, as a potential way to modulate that and be an effective treatment for PTSD?
Yeah, I think that there's quite a bit of exciting work happening right now in terms of showing that neuromodulation of particularly prefrontal cortex really might be a promising treatment for PTSD. I think my only thoughts or concerns, if you will, based on some of the data we have, is that, as we showed, there are these differences in amygdala to, let's say, dorsal prefrontal cortex connectivity between individuals of different racial and ethnic groups, and that connectivity is differentially associated with 3-month PTSD symptoms. And so there's a little bit of a concern in terms of, if we modulate that circuit, is it going to, for some individuals, improve PTSD symptoms, or for some individuals, exacerbate them? And thinking about, I think the solution to that is really to make sure that as we're doing our clinical trials and thinking about who we're applying TMS to in these sort of initial studies, is that really representative of the broader population in terms of demographics and experiences and potential modulating factors that might be impacting the sort of circuitry that we're targeting. I think that, again, it's like just 20 more seconds to expand on that. I think a lot of what we see in terms of differences in threat neurocircuitry really aren't about, just the impact of trauma, but they also reflect adaptive processes that the individuals had to survive in the different types of environments that they're exposed to. And so, not just for, we think about this for TMS too, is that going to modulate that defensive aspect or that adaptive aspect? But even thinking in terms of things like traditional therapeutic approaches, does it make sense to try to get someone into a therapy to minimize their responses to the environment that they're in, if the environment really is truly unsafe and those sort of hyperarousal symptoms are adaptive in a way? I think those are broader questions that I don't have the answer to, but we are trying to think and make sure that as we move forward with these different types of treatments, that we're doing things that consider the breadth of exposures and experiences that might be modulating the circuitry.
Well, Nate, I want to thank you for taking the time for this outstanding presentation, and more importantly, for the ongoing work that you're doing and that your lab is doing, and look forward to hearing updates down the road as the work continues. So thank you so very much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
I also want to thank our, thanks. I also want to thank our audience for joining us, and would ask people to please consider making a donation to BBRF today. 100% of every dollar donated for research is invested in our research grants. We're able to do this because our operating expenses are covered by separate foundation grants. This means that when you donate $1 for research, that dollar goes directly to the scientist. To make a gift, please go to our website, bbrfoundation.org, or call us at 1-800-829-8289. This webinar has been recorded. If you've missed any portion of the presentation or would like to share it, please visit the events and webinar page on our website. And please join us again on February 13th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, when Dr. James McPartland, the Harris Professor of Child Psychiatry and Psychology at the Yale Child Study Center, will present Developing Biological Markers to Improve Clinical Care in Autism. Thank you, and remember, together we can dramatically improve the lives of those living with mental illness and enable more people to live full, happy, and productive lives. Take care.